Good evening, everyone. Tonight, we'll step into a world of quiet gardens and whispered secrets, a place where appearances deceive and truth hides behind lace curtains. In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, where the rhythm of life is slow and predictable, even the most mundane events can, upon closer inspection, reveal a tapestry of hidden motives and dark desires. We shall witness the keen mind of a certain elderly lady, an observer of humanity, as she unravels a thread of mystery spun from a simple domestic detail. Now let us begin with Chapter 1 of the Black Cat Clue. Chapter 1. The Quiet Passing of Mrs. Pennycuick, the first hint of something. A miss in the seemingly placid existence of St. Mary Mead arrived, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the quiet, almost apologetic tolling of the church bell. 3 slow-measured chimes signaling a life had ended. This time it was Mrs. Lavinia Pennycuick, of Elm Tree Manor, a grand, if slightly faded, residence nestled behind an impressive hedge of clipped yew. Mrs. Pennycuick, a formidable lady of 83 years, had been known primarily for 2 things: her meticulously kept rose gardens, which were the envy of the entire county, and her steadfast, almost legendary devotion to her sleek, jet-black Persian cat, Midnight. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her comfortable armchair by the window, a half-knitted shawl resting on her lap, heard the news from her housekeeper, Florence. "Poor Mrs. Pennycuick, ma'am," Florence announced, bustling in with the afternoon tea tray. "Gone just like that. Dr. Harrison says it was her heart. A quiet end, they say, in her sleep." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers idly tracing the pattern on her knitting. "A sad day, Florence. Though Mrs. Pennycuick had seen a good many years. One supposes it was to be expected, but even as she uttered the polite platitude, a tiny, almost imperceptible furrow appeared between her brows. Mrs. Pennycuick, despite her advanced age, had possessed a certain vitality, a determined spirit that had seemed to defy the natural ravages of time. She had been, in Miss Marple's estimation, a woman of strong will and even stronger constitution, a formidable adversary to the march of decay. Elm Tree Manor, with its Victorian Gothic flourishes and sprawling grounds, had always been a beacon of stability in the village. Mrs. Pennycuick had lived there for nearly 60 years, a constant fixture, presiding over fêtes and garden parties with a regal air. Her passing, while not wholly unexpected given her age, still cast a slight pall over the village's afternoon routine. "And Midnight, ma'am?" Florence inquired, pouring the tea. "The poor cat. Devoted he was. All was at her heels, they say." Miss Marple paused, her cup midway to her lips. "Indeed, Florence, Midnight was quite inseparable from Mrs. Pennycuick, a most loyal companion." It was a detail that would not leave her thoughts, a small black shadow that had clung to the old lady like a second skin. Yet no one had mentioned seeing the cat since the news of Mrs. Pennycuick's demise had spread. A devoted animal, one would think, would linger near its mistress even in death. This silent absence, a mere shadow in the periphery of a greater loss, seemed to Miss Marple a peculiar note in the otherwise straightforward melody of a natural passing. As the sun began its gentle descent, painting the sky in hues of soft rose and lavender, a subtle unease settled upon Miss Marple. All seemed quiet, proper, and entirely unremarkable. Yet the image of the empty space beside Mrs. Pennycuick, a space usually occupied by a sleek black form, lingered. It was a detail that, in the quiet contemplation of her drawing-room, seemed entirely out of place, an errant thread in the tightly woven fabric of village life. Midnight, Mrs. Pennycuick's devoted black cat, was nowhere to be found. Chapter 2. A Curious Absence. The following days unfolded with the measured solemnity expected of a village bereavement. Floral tributes arrived at Elm Tree Manor, and the subdued hum of condolences filled the air. Miss Eleanor Gibbs, Mrs. Pennycuick's long-standing companion, bore the brunt of the arrangements with a quiet dignity, her face a mask of polite sorrow. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun, her movements precise and economical. She had served Mrs. Pennycuick faithfully for over 2 decades, a silent, efficient presence in the grand house. Miss Marple made her own quiet inquiries, under the guise of offering support. She paid a call to Elm Tree Manor, a plate of her famously light rock cakes in hand. The house, usually bustling with the quiet industry of daily life, felt eerily still. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight slicing through the tall windows, highlighting an absence that went beyond Mrs. Pennyquick herself. "My dear Eleanor," Miss Marple began gently as they sat in the drawing-room, sipping tea from Mrs. Pennyquick's best china. "This must be a most difficult time for you." Mrs. Pennyquick was indeed a great lady. Eleanor Gibbs dabbed delicately at the corner of her eye with a lace handkerchief. "Thank you, Miss Marple. She was my life in many ways. I hardly know what I shall do without her." Her voice was soft, laced with a tremor, yet Miss Marple detected a certain controlled quality beneath the surface of her grief. "And midnight?" Miss Marple ventured as casually as she could. "Has the poor creature returned?" Eleanor sighed, a genuine note of distress entering her voice. "No, Miss Marple, not a sign. It's most unlike him. He was so devoted to Mrs. Pennyquick, he simply vanished the morning she passed. I put out food, called for him, but nothing. It's almost as if he knew." She wrung her hands. "It quite breaks my heart on top of everything else. It doesn't feel right, him not being here." Miss Marple hummed non-committally, her eyes sweeping over the room. She noted the pristine order, the absence of even a stray cat hair. It struck her as unusual for a house where a pet had been so central to its owner's life. Perhaps Eleanor had been meticulously tidying, but it seemed almost too perfect. She had been a little unsettled, hadn't she? Miss Marple probed, recalling snippets of village gossip about Mrs. Pennyquick's recent health. Towards the end, I mean. Not merely physically frail. Eleanor hesitated, her gaze drifting towards the window, where the ancient elm trees cast long shadows across the lawn. Yes, Miss Marple, she had. Not that she ever spoke of it directly, you understand. Mrs. Pennyquick was a very private woman. But there was a restlessness about her, a distraction. She'd spend hours staring out at the garden, or sometimes she'd simply sigh, a deep, troubled sound. I put it down to her age and her heart condition, of course. But yes, she had been unsettled in her final days, not just ill. The admission, though subtle, hung in the air, a tiny discordant note, an unsettling of spirit, rather than merely of body. Miss Marple thanked Eleanor for the tea and took her leave, the image of a restless Mrs. Pennyquick and the enduring mystery of the vanished cat firmly imprinted in her mind. Eleanor had mentioned Mrs. Pennyquick had been unsettled in her final days, not just ill. Chapter 3. Whispers of the Will. The day of Mrs. Pennyquick's funeral was a gray, solemn affair. The village turned out in full, a testament to her standing, even if many had found her a touch formidable. Afterwards, a small gathering of family and close acquaintances assembled at Elm Tree Manor for the reading of the will, a customary formality that often brought out the very best or worst in human nature. Miss Marple, invited out of respect for her long acquaintance with Mrs. Pennyquick, sat quietly in a corner of the drawing-room, observing Mr. Peterson, the solicitor, a man whose face seemed perpetually etched with the gravity of legal matters, cleared his throat. He began to read, his voice devoid of emotion, outlining Mrs. Pennyquick's assets, the manor house, the extensive gardens, a considerable sum invested in various stocks and bonds. Eleanor Gibbs sat stiffly beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, her expression carefully neutral. Thomas, the taciturn gardener who had served Mrs. Pennyquick for 30 years, stood respectfully by the French windows, a silent sentinel amidst the hushed anticipation. Then came the revelations, a few minor bequests, a charitable donation, a small sum to Thomas for his loyal service, a piece of jewelry to a distant niece. And then the main beneficiary. A collective gasp, polite but audible, rippled through the room. The bulk of Mrs. Pennyquick's considerable estate, including Elm Tree Manor, was to go to a Mr. Ernest Finch, a second cousin once removed whom few in St. Mary Mead had ever heard of, and who was certainly not present. Eleanor Gibbs's carefully constructed composure fractured visibly. Her hands tightened, her knuckles turning white, and a faint flush rose on her pale cheeks. She managed a thin smile, a valiant attempt to maintain her dignity, but the shock was profound. Thomas, usually so impassive, allowed a flicker of surprise, followed by a deeper, more resentful disappointment, to cross his weather-beaten face. He had adored Mrs. Pennyquick's gardens as much as she had, and had perhaps harbored hopes for their continued care under his stewardship. Mr. Peterson explained that the will had been revised only a few weeks prior to Mrs. Pennyquick's death. This detail intensified the murmurs. Why such a sudden change, especially after decades of presumed understanding that Eleanor, her loyal companion, would be provided for? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sought out Thomas in the quiet solitude of the potting shed, ostensibly to compliment him on a particularly robust fuchsia. Thomas, a man of few words, grunted in response, his gaze fixed on a wilting cyclamen. "A sad loss, Thomas," Miss Marple began, her voice gentle. "Mrs. Pennyquick was so proud of her gardens, thanks to your tireless work." "Aye," he agreed, his voice gruff. "She loved 'em. But things changed, didn't they? Towards the end. Something was eating at her, like a canker in a rose." Miss Marple paused. "Changed how, Thomas?" He shrugged, carefully pruning a dead leaf. "Hard to say. She was always one for her routines. But lately she'd be out here, sometimes late, just staring at the elm trees. Mumbling to herself, almost. Said something once about a secret she'd kept, a family matter, long hidden. Said she had to put things right before her time came." He paused, looking directly at Miss Marple, a rare flash of emotion in his eyes. "And then she changed the will." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind racing. "A secret, a long-hidden family matter, and a sudden, drastic change to a will, only weeks before her death." The pieces were beginning to align, suggesting a pattern far more intricate than simple old age. Thomas recalled Mrs. Pennyquick talking about a secret, a long-hidden family matter, just before she changed her will. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Haste. The news of the will's contents rippled through St. Mary Mead, gathering momentum like a stone skipping across a pond. The consensus was one of shock, followed by a swift current of sympathy for poor Miss Gibbs, and a healthy dose of suspicion regarding the mysterious Mr. Ernest Finch. Miss Marple, however, focused her attention on another detail, the alacrity with which Dr. Harrison had signed Mrs. Pennyquick's death certificate. Dr. Harrison was a stout, jovial man, relatively new to the village, having taken over from the venerable Dr. Haydock a few years prior. He was well-meaning, but perhaps lacked the deep, ingrained knowledge of his patient's histories that his predecessor had possessed. Miss Marple encountered him by chance outside the village shop, where he was haggling good-naturedly over the price of asparagus. "Good afternoon, Doctor," Miss Marple greeted him, her voice mild. "A busy few days for you, I imagine, with Mrs. Pennyquick's passing." Dr. Harrison straightened, his round face assuming a more professional air. "Ah, Miss Marple, indeed, a sad business that. But a natural end, I assure you. Her heart, you see, weak for some time, despite her resilient spirit. I recall she seemed remarkably spry for her age," Miss Marple mused, as if merely reminiscing. "One would have thought she had many more years in her, given her determination." "Did you have any particular concerns leading up to her demise?" The doctor shifted his weight, a flicker of defensiveness in his eyes. "None beyond what one might expect in a lady of her years. I visited her regularly. Her pulse was strong one day, weak the next. The ebb and flow of old age. One cannot predict the exact moment, can one?" He chuckled, a slightly forced sound. "Her heart simply gave out. It happens. A quick, painless end, I have no doubt." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Of course, one simply hopes that no one ever takes advantage of such natural frailties." She let the implication hang in the air, subtle as a spider's web, yet tangible. Dr. Harrison's jovial demeanor seemed to stiffen. He muttered something about other appointments and made a hasty retreat. Her conversation with the doctor confirmed Miss Marple's quiet suspicion. He had been perhaps a little too eager to dismiss any further investigation, a little too quick to attribute Mrs. Pennyquick's death entirely to natural causes. It was not a sign of complicity, necessarily, but of a professional perhaps too reliant on surface appearances, too keen to avoid the messy complications of doubt. Back in her own drawing room, Miss Marple recalled her last visit to Elm Tree Manor. She visualized the room, the furniture. Her mind, like a finely tuned instrument, replayed every detail. And then a small, almost insignificant memory surfaced. On Mrs. Penny Kuick's favorite wing-backed armchair, the very one she had been found in, there had been a faint, unusual scratch mark on the wooden armrest. She had dismissed it at the time as an old age-related scuff, but now, combined with the unsettled state and the secret, it seemed to take on a new, more sinister meaning. A small, unusual scratch mark is found on Mrs. Penny Kuick's favorite armchair, overlooked by everyone but Miss Marple. Chapter 5. Midnight's Return. Days turned into a week, then a fortnight. The affairs of Mrs. Penny Kuick were slowly being untangled by Mr. Peterson, and the village, having exhausted its capacity for gossip regarding the will, began to settle back into its familiar rhythm. Elm Tree Manor, however, remained shrouded in an expectant silence, its future uncertain. Miss Eleanor Gibbs, though heartbroken, had found temporary lodging with a distant relative in the village, her fate now entirely dependent on the whims of Mr. Ernest Finch. It was a Tuesday afternoon, a particularly dreary day with a fine, persistent drizzle, when the second, far more tangible clue presented itself. Miss Marple was in her garden, dead-heading some wilting roses, her old gardening hat perched on her head. A flash of jet black caught her eye, low amidst the damp hydrangeas. It was midnight. The black cat, once so sleek and well-fed, now looked gaunt and bedraggled, its fur matted with rain and burrs. Its eyes, usually bright and imperious, were wide with a profound distress, a wildness Miss Marple had never seen in a domesticated animal. It let out a weak, desperate meow, a sound more like a cry than a greeting. "Midnight, my dear?" Miss Marple exclaimed, dropping her secateurs. She knelt, extending a gentle hand. The cat hesitated, then rubbed frantically against her legs, purring a ragged, uncertain purr. It was starved, thirsty, and clearly traumatized. Miss Marple carefully scooped it up, noting its bony frame. "Where have you been, you poor thing?" she murmured, stroking its wet fur. She carried Midnight into her warm kitchen, where Florence quickly prepared a bowl of cream and some tuna. The cat devoured it ravenously, but its agitation remained. It paced restlessly after its meal, sniffing at the edges of the room, its tail twitching nervously. Then, with a sudden, determined meow, Midnight padded towards the kitchen door, looked back at Miss Marple, and then nudged the door with its head, clearly inviting her to follow. Miss Marple, her curiosity piqued, followed. Midnight led her out into the damp garden, past the rose beds, and towards the far corner of Miss Marple's property, where her garden bordered the grounds of Elm Tree Manor. The cat squeezed through a gap in the ancient hedge, looking back impatiently. Miss Marple, carefully navigating the damp earth, followed. Midnight led her through a less frequented part of Mrs. Penny Kuick's garden, past an overgrown laurel bush, and stopped abruptly at a patch of ground beneath a weeping willow. The earth there looked different, recently disturbed, as if something had been hastily buried, and then smoothed over. Midnight began to scratch at the soft soil, its claws tearing at the wet earth, letting out small, insistent cries. Miss Marple watched, a prickle of intuition raising the fine hairs on her arms. This was no ordinary animal behavior. The cat was trying to tell her something. Taking her garden trowel from her pocket, she carefully began to excavate the disturbed earth, following Midnight's desperate guidance. Her heart gave a sudden lurch as the dull glint of metal appeared beneath the soil. Beneath the earth, Miss Marple unearthed a small, ornate silver locket, something Mrs. Penny Kuick always wore. Chapter 6. The Locket's Secret. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she carefully extracted the silver locket from the damp earth. It was a beautiful piece, intricately engraved with a swirling floral design, its silver dulled by its time beneath the soil. Mrs. Penny Kuick had worn it constantly, a cherished possession that rarely left her neck. Its presence here, buried in the garden, was profoundly unsettling. Midnight, having led her to its discovery, now rubbed against her ankles, purring with a faint but discernible sense of relief, as if a great burden had been lifted from its small feline shoulders. Miss Marple gently wiped the dirt from the locket and, with a delicate click, opened it. Inside, on one side, was a miniature, faded photograph of a strikingly beautiful young woman, her hair swept up in a fashionable Gibson girl style, her eyes holding a hint of playful mischief. On the other side, folded precisely, was a tiny, yellowed slip of paper. Miss Marple, her spectacles perched on her nose, carefully unfolded it. The handwriting, though faint, was elegant and distinctly Mrs. Pennycuick's. It read, "My dearest Alice, I regret the years of silence. Forgive me, the truth must out. My marriage to Arthur was legitimate, however much they sought to deny it. Our child Robert was the rightful heir. I must right this terrible wrong. The truth will set us free. L.P." Miss Marple read the cryptic note again, her mind sifting through the implications. My dearest Alice, who was Alice? And our child Robert was the rightful heir. This tied directly into Thomas's earlier comment about Mrs. Pennycuick's secret and her need to put things right. It suggested a hidden marriage, a suppressed lineage, and a profound injustice that Mrs. Pennycuick had evidently been preparing to rectify. This locket, with its devastating revelation, explained the sudden change in her will. The faded photograph, the cryptic note, it all spoke of a long-buried scandal, a family secret that had perhaps been violently disturbed. And the fact that this locket, so crucial to proving the truth, had been buried, not lost, was highly significant. Someone had wanted it hidden. Miss Marple, cradling the locket, decided she needed to speak to Eleanor Gibbs again. Under the guise of finding midnight, she visited Eleanor at her temporary lodging. My dear Eleanor, Miss Marple began, her voice soft, midnight has returned, quite starved but safe. He led me to a rather surprising discovery in Mrs. Pennycuick's garden. She paused, then presented the locket. Do you recognize this? Eleanor's eyes, usually so composed, widened perceptibly, and a genuine tremor ran through her. Her pale cheeks flushed a deep crimson, and she stared at the locket as if it were a venomous snake. The locket, she stammered, her voice thin. Yes, of course, Mrs. Pennycuick's, but how did it come to be buried? Her eyes darted from the locket to Miss Marple, a flash of fear or apprehension in their depths. Indeed, Miss Marple replied, her gaze steady. That is precisely what I hope to understand. I believe Mrs. Pennycuick always wore this? Eleanor nodded, her breathing shallow. She did, every day. She was distraught when she lost it, absolutely beside herself. It happened, weeks ago, just before she started to feel unwell. She searched everywhere, but it simply vanished. She truly thought she had misplaced it. Eleanor's admission, her genuine distress over the locket's loss, seemed to exonerate her from burying it herself. Yet the way her composure fractured at its sight was telling. Eleanor, looking startled, admitted Mrs. Pennycuick had lost that locket weeks ago and had been terribly upset about it. Chapter 7. Mr. Finch's Arrival. The arrival of Mr. Ernest Finch in St. Mary Mead was met with a mixture of polite curiosity and underlying suspicion. He was a man of impeccable appearance, perhaps 45 years of age, with a well-trimmed mustache and a ready, if somewhat superficial, smile. He exuded an air of urban sophistication that felt distinctly out of place in the rustic charm of the village. He took up temporary residence at Elm Tree Manor, intending, he declared, to settle affairs and oversee the sale of some of Mrs. Pennycuick's belongings. Miss Marple encountered him one afternoon in the village square, where he was engaging in a rather boisterous conversation with the local antiques dealer, already discussing the valuation of Mrs. Pennycuick's furniture. He acknowledged Miss Marple with a charming, if brief, nod. "Ah, Miss Marple, isn't it?" he began, extending a manicured hand. "Ernest Finch. So pleased to finally meet Mrs. Pennycuick's esteemed neighbor. Such a tragedy, her passing. Though one must say, a life well lived, and at a grand old age, too." His tone was smooth, almost dismissive of the deeper implications of her death. "Indeed, Mr. Finch," Miss Marple replied, her eyes like keen blue drills assessing him. "A long life, though perhaps with more burdens than one might imagine. He chuckled, a light, airy sound. Perhaps all old families have their skeletons, don't they? But the main thing is she passed peacefully. The good doctor assured me it was merely her heart giving out. A frail old thing, after all. He waved a hand dismissively. Now, if you'll excuse me, I must ensure these fellows don't try to undervalue Aunt Lavinia's rather impressive collection of porcelain. One must be vigilant, mustn't one? His eagerness to delve into the estate, his almost casual dismissal of Mrs. Pennyquick's frailty, struck Miss Marple as odd, almost calculating. It lacked the genuine grief or respect one might expect from a relative, even a distant one, who had just inherited a considerable fortune. He seemed more concerned with the acquisition of assets than the loss of a person. I imagine you are well acquainted with all of Mrs. Pennyquick's possessions, then, Mr. Finch? Miss Marple inquired, her voice still mild. Including perhaps her more personal effects? He paused, a slight frown creasing his brow. One does one's best, Miss Marple. Though, to be honest, I hadn't seen Aunt Lavinia in years. Not since I was a boy. I'm afraid I'm quite a stranger to her daily life. Eleanor, the companion, has been most helpful, of course. She knows everything, apparently. Quite the fount of information. He gave a tight smile. She even mentioned a locket Aunt Lavinia was rather fond of, though it seems to have vanished. Indeed, Miss Marple said, allowing a beat of silence to hang in the air. She watched his reaction carefully. There was no surprise in his voice about the locket's disappearance, only a casual acceptance. It has in fact been recovered. She did not elaborate on how or where. Mr. Finch merely raised an eyebrow. Oh, well, that's splendid news, I suppose, though I doubt it holds much monetary value. Still, if it means something to, well, to Eleanor, perhaps? He seemed completely uninterested in the locket itself, only its potential for sale. His dismissal of its significance, coupled with his earlier remark about Mrs. Pennyquick's frailty, coalesced into a portrait of a man whose primary interest was material gain, and who would perhaps wish for no complications to arise. Mr. Finch makes a casual remark about Mrs. Pennyquick's frailty that strikes Miss Marple as odd, almost calculating. Chapter 8. A Matter of Routine. Miss Marple possessed an extraordinary knack for understanding human nature, much of which she attributed to her lifelong observations of the villagers of St. Mary Mead. She knew that routines were the very fabric of life, especially for the elderly. A change in routine, however small, could be highly significant. Mrs. Pennyquick, a creature of habit, would have had her days mapped out with almost military precision. The lost locket, the changed will, Mr. Finch's convenient inheritance, and the doctor's quick assessment of natural causes. All these threads now seemed to point towards a deliberate act, a carefully constructed deception. Miss Marple decided to revisit Elm Tree Manor, ostensibly to offer Eleanor Gibbs some comfort, and to inquire further about Mrs. Pennyquick's last days. Eleanor, still at her relative's cottage, seemed grateful for the distraction. She was clearly struggling with her sudden loss of home and purpose. Miss Marple, however, had a specific objective in mind. "I was just thinking, Eleanor," she began, as they shared a cup of tea, not the special brew from Elm Tree Manor, but a simple Earl Grey. Mrs. Pennyquick had such set ways, didn't she? Did anything in her routine change at all in the weeks before she passed? Eleanor pondered this, her brow furrowed in concentration. Not dramatically, Miss Marple. Her morning constitutional, her afternoon rest, her letters, all much the same, though she did take to a particular tea, a sort of herbal infusion. Someone had sent it to her anonymously, a well-wisher, after she mentioned feeling a little peaky at the last village fete. Said it was for calming the nerves and aiding digestion. Miss Marple's ears perked up. An anonymous well-wisher? How curious. And she drank it regularly? Oh, yes. Most religiously, Eleanor confirmed. She said it made her feel much better, though sometimes a little drowsy. She always took it with her evening meal, just before retiring. I prepared it for her, of course, always from the special blend that came in a pretty ceramic jar. And did anyone else ever take this tea? Miss Marple asked, her voice light, but her mind sharply focused. Goodness, no. Eleanor laughed softly. It was quite specific to Mrs. Pennyquick's needs, you see. I tasted it once, just a sip, to ensure it wasn't too strong. It was rather pleasant, actually. A little earthy. Miss Marple filed this away. An anonymous gift. A new regular habit. A special blend prepared by Eleanor. It was a detail, seemingly benign, that suddenly glowed with significance in Miss Marple's mind. She observed Eleanor, who seemed genuinely guileless in her recounting of this routine, seemingly unaware of its potential implications. Yet the small crack in Eleanor's composure when the locket was presented still lingered in Miss Marple's memory. The visit concluded, Miss Marple returned home, her thoughts a whirl of possibilities. An anonymous well-wisher? In a village where everyone knew everyone else's business, such a gift would normally be accompanied by a card, a name. And why that particular tea? The locket had set the stage for Mrs. Pennyquick's change of will, but something else must have ensured she wouldn't have the chance to fully implement her intentions. Eleanor, in a moment of distraction, reveals Mrs. Pennyquick had developed a new habit recently, drinking a specific herbal tea given to her by an anonymous well-wisher. Chapter 9. The Herbal Remedy. The herbal tea became the next focus of Miss Marple's quiet investigation. In a village like St. Mary Mead, where old wives' remedies and country lore still held sway, local knowledge of plants and their properties was surprisingly extensive. Miss Marple paid a visit to Mrs. Green, the village herbalist, a spry old woman with keen eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of every root, leaf, and blossom within a 50-mile radius. "Herbal tea for calming nerves, you say, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Green repeated, adjusting her spectacles. "Aye, there are many such concoctions. Chamomile, lavender, valerian, all good, but some can be deceptive if not used rightly." She tapped a gnarled finger on her counter. "Are we speaking of something gentle, or something with a bit more potency?" Miss Marple described the tea as Eleanor had recounted it, a special blend, a little earthy, and causing some drowsiness. "It was in a ceramic jar, Mrs. Green, said to be from an anonymous well-wisher for Mrs. Pennyquick's nerves." Mrs. Green hummed, her eyes thoughtful. "Anonymous, you say? And for Mrs. Pennyquick?" She was a strong woman, not one to take easily to nerves. Though I suppose even the strongest among us can be brought low." She paused, picking up a dried leaf and crumbling it between her fingers. "I know of a plant, grows wild in these parts, often mistaken for a common weed, particularly in the shadier, damp corners of old gardens. It has a slightly earthy smell when dried, and when brewed into a tea, it can indeed be calming at first, but in larger or cumulative doses, especially for someone with a weak heart, well, it's not something you'd want to be taking regularly." "And the name of this plant, Mrs. Green?" Miss Marple inquired, a chill tracing its way down her spine. "Foxglove," Mrs. Green replied, her voice soft but firm. "Or digitalis, as the learned folk call it. A beautiful flower, but a treacherous one. A small dose can regulate the heart. Too much, and it will seize it entirely, mimicking a natural heart failure. A very quiet, very insidious way to go if one knew how to administer it." She looked at Miss Marple, her knowing eyes piercing. "And it grows in Mrs. Pennyquick's own garden, Miss Marple, down by the old stone wall near the elm trees. I often used to tell her she ought to clear it out, but she always said it added a touch of wildness. The pieces began to click into place with terrifying precision. Foxglove, growing in Mrs. Pennyquick's own garden. An anonymous herbal tea, the drowsiness, the calming effect, followed by a slow cumulative poisoning designed to mimic heart failure in an elderly woman. It was ingenious, devious, and utterly cold-blooded. This explained the unsettled feeling, the subtle decline that Eleanor had dismissed as mere age. The scratch on the armchair, the lost locket, Midnight's disappearance, the changed will, all were now becoming part of a meticulously constructed narrative of murder. Someone had wanted Mrs. Pennyquick gone, quickly and quietly, before she could fully act on the explosive truth contained within that silver locket, and they had chosen a method that would leave no trace, no obvious suspicion. The herbalist mentions a particular plant that grows in Mrs. Pennyquick's own garden, often mistaken for a common weed, but which is subtly poisonous. Chapter 10. Unveiling the Connection. The revelation about the foxglove tea cast a chilling new light on everything. Miss Marple now had a clear picture of the how. A slow, cumulative poison administered under the guise of a beneficial remedy. The why was equally compelling, the contents of the locket. Mrs. Pennyquick's secret marriage to a man named Arthur, and their son, Robert, who would have been the rightful heir to Elm Tree Manor. This meant Mr. Ernest Finch. The recent beneficiary was a mere pretender, his claim rendered null and void by the legitimate heir. But who was Robert? And more importantly, who was Alice, the woman in the photograph to whom Mrs. Pennyquick had written her apology? Miss Marple deduced that Alice must be Robert's daughter, or a descendant, meaning she was the true inheritor. Mrs. Pennyquick, in her final weeks, must have discovered this descendant and intended to rectify the decades-old injustice. This was the secret Thomas had overheard her speaking of, and the reason for her sudden drastic will change. The timeline now made grim sense. Mrs. Pennyquick had discovered the truth, perhaps after some old family papers surfaced. She had begun to take steps to alter her will. But before she could finalize these plans, the locket, the vital proof, had vanished. Who had taken it? Someone who knew its significance. Someone who had access to Mrs. Pennyquick and her possessions. Miss Marple re-examined the scratch on Mrs. Pennyquick's favorite armchair. It was not a casual scuff. It was a series of frantic, desperate marks, low on the inner armrest, as if someone had been clawing, trying to reach something under the cushion. And what if that something was the very locket that Eleanor had claimed was lost? What if, in her final moments, weakened by the slow-acting poison, Mrs. Pennyquick had realized her companion's betrayal and was trying to retrieve the hidden proof? And Midnight, the loyal black cat. His sudden disappearance wasn't just a sign of his mistress's passing. It was deliberate. Perhaps he had witnessed something. Or perhaps, when the locket was hidden or the tea prepared, he had been a nuisance and had been locked away or scared off, only returning when hunger finally drove him back. His distressed state and his unerring ability to lead Miss Marple to the buried locket underscored his role as a silent witness. The motive was clear: to prevent the true heir from inheriting and to ensure the current beneficiaries remained in line. This pointed to two people, Mr. Ernest Finch, who stood to gain everything, and Miss Eleanor Gibbs, who stood to lose everything. Eleanor, a woman who had devoted her life to Mrs. Pennyquick, perhaps under the expectation of a comfortable inheritance, only to find herself disinherited by the revised will. Her position, her future, her very sense of self, depended on Mrs. Pennyquick's former will remaining in force. The locket's contents, once revealed, would not only disinherit Mr. Finch, but also Eleanor, as the will she expected would provide for her would likely have been superseded by the discovery of the true heir. The black cat had led her to the hidden truth, a truth that someone had desperately tried to bury, literally and figuratively. Miss Marple realized the scratch on the armchair wasn't an accident, but a desperate final act by Mrs. Pennyquick to retrieve something hidden, something that could expose the true culprit. Chapter 11. The Calculated Revelation. Miss Marple decided it was time to bring the players together. Under the pretext of discussing a memorial for Mrs. Pennyquick, she invited Mr. Ernest Finch, Miss Eleanor Gibbs, Dr. Harrison, and Mr. Peterson, the solicitor, to her drawing room. The atmosphere was one of polite expectation, though a subtle undercurrent of tension, like electricity before a storm, permeated the air. Midnight, now fully recovered and sleek, sat curled on Miss Marple's lap, a silent, knowing presence. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, began in her usual gentle, conversational tone. It is a peculiar thing, the way life unravels, isn't it? One sees a pattern, a comfortable, familiar design, and then a small snag, an odd stitch, and suddenly the whole fabric begins to reveal something quite different. She spoke of Mrs. Pennyquick's long life, her strong character, and her meticulous nature. She then introduced the subject of the will and the profound surprise it had caused. Mr. Finch shifted uncomfortably, and Eleanor Gibbs stiffened, her gaze fixed on her hands. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "Mrs. Pennyquick was a woman who always strove for truth, however difficult. And it seems, in her final weeks, she uncovered a truth about her own family, one that compelled her to rewrite her will. She produced the silver locket. This, for instance, a treasured possession. Yet it was found buried in the garden, having been reported lost." Eleanor's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Mr. Finch merely frowned, though a faint flush crept up his neck. "Inside," Miss Marple went on, opening the locket, "was a photograph of a young woman, and a note from Mrs. Pennyquick, speaking of a legitimate but suppressed marriage and a rightful heir named Robert, the ancestor of the true inheritor." She paused, letting the words sink in. "This, Mr. Finch, would invalidate your claim entirely, as the previous will would have been a mistake based on incomplete information." Mr. Finch cleared his throat, attempting to regain his composure. "Preposterous! A note from an old woman, perhaps confused in her final days." "This is hardly legal proof." "Perhaps not, on its own," Miss Marple conceded, her gaze unwavering. "But it explains why Mrs. Pennyquick changed her will so drastically. And it explains why someone might have wished for that truth to remain hidden. Someone who took this locket, hid it, and then perhaps ensured that Mrs. Pennyquick would not live long enough to reveal the full truth or finalize the necessary legal documents." She then turned her attention to the herbal tea. "Dr. Harrison, you assured us of Mrs. Pennyquick's natural passing. But tell me, were you aware of a particular herbal tea she was regularly consuming, given by an anonymous well-wisher?" Dr. Harrison blanched, suddenly looking ill at ease. "A tea? No, Miss Marple, I was not. It seems this calming tea, brewed from foxglove, a plant that grows freely in Mrs. Pennyquick's own garden, was subtly poisoning her, slowly weakening her heart, until it gave out." Miss Marple's voice was utterly devoid of accusation, simply stating facts. A clever method, as it mimicked natural causes perfectly. She looked at each face in turn. "So we have a clear motive, the locket, the truth of the rightful heir, and the resulting change in the will. We have a means, the foxglove tea, and we have a timeline, the locket vanishing, the tea appearing, the will changing, and then Mrs. Pennyquick's demise." Her gaze settled, finally and with a quiet certainty, upon Miss Eleanor Gibbs, whose composure, previously so carefully maintained, began to fracture. The carefully constructed mask of grief and loyalty now showed hairline cracks, revealing a terrifying desperation underneath. Chapter 12. The Truth Unveiled. The silence that followed Miss Marple's quiet summation was profound, broken only by the soft purr of midnight in her lap. Eleanor Gibbs, rigid in her chair, met Miss Marple's steady gaze, her eyes darting like a trapped bird. Her face, usually so placid, was now a canvas of barely suppressed terror and resentment. "Eleanor, my dear," Miss Marple began, her voice soft, "you stated that Mrs. Pennyquick had lost her locket weeks ago and was distraught, yet it was found buried. And you were the one who prepared her calming tea each evening. You had access to her garden, to the foxgloves. And you, perhaps more than anyone, knew the inner workings of Mrs. Pennyquick's life, her habits, her frailties." Eleanor took a ragged breath. I don't know what you mean. This is outrageous. I love Mrs. Pennyquick." "Did you, Eleanor?" Miss Marple countered gently. "Or did you merely rely on her? You had given 20 years of your life to her, no doubt expecting a comfortable future, a secure old age at Elm Tree Manor. Then Mrs. Pennyquick found the truth about her previous marriage and the existence of a true heir. She changed her will. This meant not only that Mr. Finch would lose his inheritance, but that you, Eleanor, would be left with nothing. Your future, which you had earned with years of faithful service, vanished before your eyes. You were to be disinherited, not by Mrs. Pennyquick's unkindness, but by the re-emergence of justice." Eleanor's mask crumbled entirely. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of fury, not sorrow. "She betrayed me? After all I did?" I devoted my life, and she was going to cast me aside for some distant ghost, some old forgotten scandal. Her voice rose raw with bitterness. I found the locket first. I found it when she was rummaging through old papers. I saw the truth, and I knew what it meant for me. I hid it. I thought if it was gone, the truth would die with it. Miss Marple nodded. And when Mrs. Pennyquick, in her final days, weakened by your poison, began searching for the locket, perhaps sensing your betrayal, perhaps trying to retrieve it from where you had hidden it under the armchair cushion, she made those desperate scratches, a final, desperate attempt to expose the truth. You administered the foxglove tea, knowing it would slowly, imperceptibly claim her life, making it seem like a natural end. Eleanor Gibbs broke down fully, sobbing uncontrollably. The weight of her secret and Miss Marple's calm, undeniable dissection of her crime was too much. She confessed to taking the locket, hiding it in the armchair, and then, in a calculated act of despair and self-preservation, harvesting the foxglove from the garden, drying it, and adding it to the herbal tea she so solicitously prepared for her mistress each night. She had even scared midnight away, fearing the cat's loyal presence or sharp senses might disrupt her plan. The police were called, and Eleanor Gibbs was taken away, her cries echoing long after the door had closed. Mr. Finch, though absolved of murder, found his newfound fortune evaporating, replaced by the reality of a true heir whose existence would now undoubtedly be proven through the locket's contents. Miss Marple sat in the quiet of her drawing-room, midnight once more purring contentedly on her lap. The village would talk for weeks, the polite veneer of St. Mary Mead briefly shattered. But the truth, however ugly, had been uncovered. It was a stark reminder, as Miss Marple often observed, that beneath the most tranquil exteriors, human nature, driven by fear and greed, could harbor the darkest of impulses. The moral lesson, as always, was that secrets, like seeds, could lie dormant for years, only to sprout into bitter fruit when disturbed, claiming innocence and poisoning lives. If you've enjoyed our journey through mystery so far, do stay with Miss Marple until the very end, for even the smallest clue